Today we are talking about everyone's favorite farm girl. Welcome to Teacup for One. My name is Matt and I have 2 degrees. I'm in a different space today, don't worry about it. My name is Matt and I have 2 degrees, and here we are, friends, nearing the end of the longest intermission of all time. Wicked Part 1 was released last November, and with Wicked for Good, why isn't it called Wicked Part 2? Why wasn't Wicked Part 1 called something? Anyway, with Wicked for Good set to release in a matter of days, people over the last year have been asking the same question.
Who's Dorothy? Who's Dorothy?
And first, let me just say, I am so glad that people have finally caught up, because I have been wondering about this casting decision since the very first teaser trailer dropped over a year ago. Remember Super Bowl Sunday? That was a magical day. But anyway, that trailer dropped and all I could think was, who is playing Dorothy? I mean, we only saw her feet and her back. It could have been anyone. And I figured that maybe that was the case. Maybe the extent of Dorothy's role in Wicked or Wicked for Good would be little more than what we got in the trailer, which would mean the role could be played by anyone, a stand-in, an existing dancer from the ensemble who had the right look. But then I noticed it was very difficult to find a name for whoever that person could be. And eventually the internet did its thing and started to notice too, because now everyone has started speculating over actors who could potentially be playing everyone's favorite farm brat, with names being thrown around like Dove Cameron, Tori from the Oz Vlog, Alicia Weird, Little Vampire Girl, and my personal vote, AI Judy Garland. That's not my personal vote. Honestly, I'm less interested in who is playing Dorothy in Wicked for Good than I'm interested in how Dorothy is going to be portrayed. Because in Wicked on stage, Dorothy just appears as a shadow during the melting scene. But fun fact, if you are lucky enough to get an obstructed view seat that's like just high enough and just off to the side enough, like I did back in Toronto in 2006, you might get a chance to glimpse the actor who is providing Dorothy's shadow, and they have her in a full blue gingham dress, specifically for you, the person with that obstructed view, and I appreciated it. But the point is, Wicked is Elphaba's story. Dorothy doesn't really matter, so Dorothy in the movie shouldn't matter. And at this point, it has basically been confirmed that we will not see her face in the film. Though I am still holding out hope that maybe the twist in this movie will be a Dorothy face reveal. I don't know, Universal didn't invite me to any invited screening, so I have no way of knowing. Anyway, that got me to thinking. There is something kind of sacred about Dorothy compared to all of the other Oz characters. You know, it seems easy enough to accept certain characters being reinvented or reimagined. I mean, heck, that is literally what all of Wicked is built on. But it does seem like a very conscious choice to not include Dorothy in the mix, almost like she's untouchable. So what is it that makes Dorothy so special? Today, we are going to try to answer that question by diving into the history and evolution of Dorothy Gale. From books, to movies, to stage productions, to young adult books I have not read, everyone's favorite farm girl has a legacy lasting over 125 years, and she continues to engage and fascinate fans. I've done a few of these Oz evolution video essays by now, and usually I like to start with the 1939 MGM film, because let's be honest, even though it wasn't first, it is the piece of Oz media that set a standard and became the prototype for how people would go on to think of Oz, to think of the characters of Oz. But we're not doing that today, because I think Dorothy is the exception to that rule. Across Oz adaptations, characters change, backstories change, but with very few exceptions, Dorothy essentially remains the same. She is the constant, she is the grounding force, heart of the story. And to truly understand Dorothy, I think we need to understand the women of L. Frank Baum's life. L. Frank Baum being, of course, the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Specifically, one woman from his life. Matilda Joslyn Gage. Oof, we could talk about Matilda Joslyn Gage for over an hour, but I am going to try to give you a very brief overview on this absolute queen, without whom we would not have Oz and we would not have Dorothy in more ways than one. Matilda Joslyn Gage. This was a woman who, in the 1800s, was speaking out about hot-button topics like divorce, abortion, the separation of church and state. She led a protest at the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty, standing with a speaking trumpet, like a big megaphone thing, and a banner that said, "American liberty restored when all women are given the right to vote." Essentially, she was making the argument that it made absolutely no sense for the image of American freedom to be a woman when women in America had no rights. This was a lady who would be canceled today by certain political figures, by certain wizards, And yes, her ideas and philosophies ultimately helped give us Oz and gave us Dorothy. But I am getting ahead of myself. Matilda Joslyn Gage was born March 24th, 1826. Her mother was a passionate historian. Her father was a physician and early abolitionist. She grew up in New York State with an upbringing that set her on course for a life dedicated to both women's rights and human rights. As a child, her family home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and she was actively involved in abolitionism. At the same time, she was being educated by her physician father and gaining an interest in medicine. As a young adult, she dreamed of being a doctor, but she was denied admission to medical school because she was a woman, and it was the 1800s. As she got older, her activism continued, and she became a key player in early American suffrage, which she quite literally wrote the book on. She collaborated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony on the book, History of Women's Suffrage. Yes, she was a peer and collaborator of the Susan B. Anthony, but the two had a falling out, which is largely why so many people have heard of Susan B. Anthony and so few people have heard of Matilda Joslyn Gage. But that is another topic for another day. That's another tea spilling party. Now, let me paint a picture for you. It is 1882. Matilda is hard at work on her chapter for History of Women's Suffrage. She is ready to change the world when her daughter Maud shows up and announces, "Hi, Mom, I'm dropping out of school to marry an unemployed actor." For context, Matilda had 4 children. Maud was the youngest, and she was the first and only one of Matilda's 3 girls to attend university. Maud was on track to become a doctor or a lawyer, which was something that had only recently become an option for women. Basically, Maud was living Matilda's dream, not just for herself, but for society as a whole. And then her kid made the choice to drop all of it to marry a chicken farmer turned actor. So Matilda was pissed. She told Maud that she would be a damned fool to throw away her education, and then Maud shot back with, "All right, well, mother, I'm going to marry him, and clearly you don't want a damned fool in your home, so goodbye forever." That is only a mild paraphrase. That exchange, by all reports, basically happened. And reportedly, that exchange struck a chord with Matilda. She laughed it off. She accepted Maud's choice, most likely accepting that she had raised Maud to advocate for herself, and this was how she was advocating for herself. And if you're wondering how this connects to The Wizard of Oz, if you haven't figured it out yet, the chicken farmer turned actor for whom Maud was throwing away her education was L. Frank Baum, future author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. With Frank joining the Gage family, he was thrown into their activism, and he quickly became part of it himself, sharing most of Matilda's values. Most. I am going to go off topic for a second, just to acknowledge the fact that Matilda was also a fierce advocate for Indigenous rights. And Frank was not, to put it mildly. In 1890, he wrote a pair of editorials calling for the extermination of Native Americans, which is horrifying and indefensible, no matter how you frame it. It is a very stark contrast to his support for women's equality. Thankfully, he did not write a thinly veiled allegory for his racism and market it as a children's book like certain Roald dolls that I could mention, #the witches. Instead, his writing became largely influenced by feminism, values he grew to share with the Gage family, which became more prominent in his writing the longer he was married to Maud. Frank served as secretary for the Aberdeen Equal Suffrage Club in 1890, and he often wrote articles and editorials in support of voting for women's rights. At one time writing, "We must do away with sex prejudice and render equal distinction and reward to brains and ability, no matter whether found in man or woman." Around the same time, Matilda began to encourage Frank to shift his writing towards fiction, seeing as it was a potential source of revenue for the family, and also suggesting very specifically that he should write a series of adventures and bring in a cyclone, which I don't think anyone can deny was a winning idea. But she also said to create a hymn, fiction which comes with a moral, without, however, any attempt to sermonize, which is just really good writer advice in general. And that's the key thing. When you look at The Wizard of Oz's slew of feminist themes, nothing is preachy. It just is. Because outside of taking Matilda's advice, at this point in his life, I think Frank had such a clear worldview, influenced by Matilda and Maud, that it would inevitably have influenced his writing. Because think back to that statement that he made. We must do away with sex prejudice and render equal distinction and reward to brains and ability, no matter whether found in man or woman. That was written in a political context. But I think this is the outlook that paved the yellow brick road towards the creation of Dorothy, a character thrown into a survival situation that ultimately tests her brains, her ability, and resilience. And she also happens to be a little girl. And let's take a moment to consider how revolutionary that was for the time. Because aside from Alice, there weren't really any girls as the central characters in this type of literature, let alone American literature. I mean, you have the March sisters, who are absolute queens in their own right, but their story is very domestic. Dorothy is an all-American kid who is going on an adventure, something that had been reserved for boys like Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. And much like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, Dorothy is not that special. Hear me out. That's what makes her so special. She even says at one point, if we walk far enough, sometime we shall come to some place. Dorothy isn't magical like Peter Pan. She isn't quirky and privileged like Alice. She is someone who just wants to get home and does what she needs to do to make that happen. So why did Frank pick a little girl as the central character when he finally decided to write The Wizard of Oz? Nobody knows. Literally, it's not documented. But there are some educated guesses that just makes sense. I mean, first, why not a little girl? This is the guy who said do away with sex prejudice, so maybe we just leave it there. But we're not just going to leave it there, because also, there is a case to be made that The Wizard of Oz was heavily influenced by Matilda Gage's nonfiction book called Women, Church, and State, which I'll talk about in depth one day in the future, whenever I do my Evolution of the Wizard video. The short version is that Wizard of Oz, as inspired by Matilda's book, is an exploration of a matriarchal society in contrast to the patriarchy of America, so the story just wouldn't hit the same if it was a boy as the main character versus a girl as the main character. But also, it has been suggested that Frank named Dorothy after his wife Maud's niece, Dorothy Louise Gage, who died at only 5 months old due to congestion of the brain. Dorothy's death hit the Gage family hard, particularly Maud, who was so heartbroken over the loss. And so, although it's not documented, many folks believe that Frank named his central character Dorothy after his late niece as a means of preserving her memory. And it really would track. It has been suggested that Uncle Henry was named for Matilda's husband, Henry Hill Gage, and that Aunt M was named for Matilda herself, but like Aunt M. No, it's supposed to be the letter, I'm making a heart. Aunt M, the letter M. It's a stretch, but I choose to believe it. But regardless of what was intentional, undoubtedly, Dorothy was a product of Frank's love and admiration for the women in his life and the ideals that they stood for, potentially named for one of the women of the Gage lineage. So for that reason, I choose to believe that she was named for Dorothy Gage, even if it wasn't a deliberate choice, but I think it was. So that is a brief overview of the inspirations that potentially shaped Dorothy when Baum was crafting The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And across his 14 Oz books, Dorothy solidified herself as a beacon of friendship, resilience, and acceptance. Traits that, with very few exceptions, continue to inform portrayals of the character to this day. We'll dive into that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about another one of Dorothy's qualities that have been largely unchanged over the past 125 years: her wardrobe. Much like Disney princesses, Dorothy is a very color-coded character. You cannot see blue gingham without thinking of Dorothy Gale, and it's an aesthetic trait that is so strongly tied to the character that it affects virtually every depiction of Dorothy, whether productions choose to embrace it or not. Like if you don't put Dorothy in blue, that was a conscious choice to avoid the blue for one reason or another. And I know this feels like another one of those byproducts of MGM's film, the Adrian designed blue gingham dress. It's undoubtedly one of the most influential costumes and most recognizable costumes in all of Hollywood history. But the movie didn't invent the dress. The dress is actually one of the few cases where the MGM film is faithful to Baum's book. Because in the original text, L. Frank Baum is very specific about Dorothy wearing a blue gingham dress. In one of the early passages during her time in Munchkinland, the Munchkins identify that part of the reason they are convinced that she is a good witch is because of the blue gingham dress. Because blue is the color of Munchkinland and white is the color of good witches in Oz. Therefore, blue, white coming together. Oh, she's the good witch savior of the Munchkins. And it's fascinating to look at the blue dress in the context of when Baum created it and in terms of what it's become with regard to fashion history and color connotation. Because the blue gingham dress meant something entirely different to an audience in 1900 when the book was published than it does to a 2025 audience. If you are a living human watching this video, you probably grew up with the cultural norm that blue is the boy color and pink is the girl color. And while respecting that gender doesn't exist, pink is the color widely associated with femininity. Still, I mean, just look at the Glinda branding. But that's a relatively new concept. At the turn of the century, pink was considered the stronger color of the two and therefore was reserved for boys. And blue was largely associated with girls for a few reasons, but the most interesting and potentially relevant one to Dorothy that I found was its connection to the biblical figure of Mary, specifically Mama Mary, not Magdalene Mary. The Virgin Mary has been depicted in blue for over 1,000 years, even though my labor-intensive Wikipedia research tells me that the Bible never actually mentions the color at any point in relation to her. So why do we have that connection? Why is she always decked out in those fancy art pieces in blue? Because blue signifies the sky, which connects to heaven and purity. And if we look at textile history, blue was expensive to make. And this was usually a color only worn by royalty and people of status. So putting her in blue identified her as this pure, heavenly, queen-like character. You know, all the traits that you want associated with a little girl. Because what did that Alfonso Cuarón 1990s movie teach us? All little girls are princesses. So yes, long story short, when Baum was writing Wizard of Oz, blue, it was the girl color. As we moved into the early 20th century, however, the idea of assigning colors to genders really started to take off because of capitalism. Surprise, surprise. Previously, baby and children's clothing had been mostly gender neutral, like mostly white. However, retailers and manufacturers began to realize that they could sell more products if there were color variations. So anyway, this idea was just starting to catch on. And for the first time, people were starting to specifically articulate that boys got one color, girls get another. In 1918, there was an edition of Ladies' Journal that just outright said, the generally accepted rule is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. Just 20 years later, leading up into the 1940s, there was a shift. And society decided that blue was the stronger color and the boys got it, and pink was the more delicate color and that was for the girls. Well, what was also happening leading up to the 1940s, MGM was producing The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy was being outfitted in a delicate blue dress inspired by the source material, of course, but the blue was also in alignment with the widely accepted girl color of the time. However, shortly after the film was released, that was when society decided that boys wear blue and girls wear pink. And it put Dorothy in this unique position as the 20th century progressed. Because you have the quintessential all-American girl, but her signature color is the boy color. And as the years progressed and more girl protagonists graced the silver screen, blue sort of became their signature color. Think Alice, Wendy, Cinderella, kind of. Her dress isn't actually blue. We don't have time for that now. Belle, Dolores from Westworld, the list goes on and on. In a 2017 article for Allure, Latrice Eisman of the Pantone Color Institute commented on this trend, giving a 21st century perspective. She said, "You're adding a bit of power to the character by giving her blue. It's a very subtle way of saying, yeah, but young women, young girls can be empowered too." We live in an era where the cultural norm of blue for girls is long forgotten. And it's incredible to see how a design choice that would have been relatively mundane at the time has aged so beautifully as a way of reflecting a girl character as an outlier in society rather than a girl character who conforms to society. And it's so perfect for Dorothy because she is a character who was so far ahead of her time and continues to be an outlier to the point of becoming a central figure in queer culture. The Wizard of Oz is so strongly tied to the LGBTQIA+ community, and a lot of that has to do with Dorothy, going all the way back to L. Frank Baum's original books. In Dorothy, Baum created a character that has just aged beautifully as a queer ally and as a possible member of the queer community herself. The first Oz book firmly establishes Dorothy as someone who is open and accepting of all different types of people. And this is really the core reason that she's seen as a gay icon and a probable reason for the term friend of Dorothy coming into popularity. But it was really Baum's fifth Oz book that literally spelled it out with one of the most quotable moments in the series when Dorothy is told, You have some queer friends, Dorothy. I don't think the character actually talks like that. That's just my interpretation. To which Dorothy replies, the queerness doesn't matter so long as they're friends. She's not British. Why did the queerness doesn't matter so long as they're friends. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this moment lands very differently in a 2025 context than it would have when Baum was writing his Oz series. Even though the term queer was just starting to be used in regard to gay men, mainstream media still acknowledged it as a synonym for odd or unusual. But that said, the sentiment still speaks for itself, and it's taken on new, deeper meanings as Dorothy essentially articulated allyship in one breath. The queerness doesn't matter so long as they're friends. And later, in the same book, there's a moment when Dorothy is reunited with Ozma, Ozma being the Princess of Oz, and the two share a kiss. There's even an illustration. Once again, this is something that lands very differently today than it would have when the book was published. But that doesn't take away from the moment's impact, because no matter how you spin it, the relationship between Dorothy and Ozma is extremely queer-coded. First of all, Ozma is the transgender Princess of Oz. In canon, shortly after Ozma was born, she was turned into a boy. She was literally assigned a male identity by the Wicked Witch Mombi, who raised her as a boy named Tip with no knowledge of her true identity. But eventually the truth is revealed, and then Tip is turned back into her true form, a girl, Ozma, Princess of Oz. Ozma has become a bit of a trans icon, even if that wasn't Baum's intention when creating her. And Ozma's deep friendship with Dorothy is just another shining example of Dorothy's allyship. But it doesn't end there, because there is a case to be made for Dorothy and Ozma possibly being in love. Again, almost certainly not Baum's intention, but he created a deep, loving relationship between these two girls. The books constantly touch on how close they are, how Dorothy is the only person allowed into Ozma's chamber without an invitation. Basically, if these books were published today, these are two characters who would be shipped. And it doesn't even matter how old they are, these characters actually are still shipped. They have a cute couple name, Dorsma. I think that's how you say it, Dorsma. Dorsma, it's fun to say. But as a rule, Baum pretty much never included romantic relationships in the Oz books. But even if Baum didn't intend for it, Oz became a world that embraced difference, and that world reached new levels of visibility with MGM's film and the legend herself, Judy Garland. Judy Garland is the quintessential Dorothy, even if the film came so close to missing the mark on the character more than once. Shirley Temple was famously considered for the role before it went to Judy Garland. Surely you can't be serious. I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. Shirley was closer in age to Dorothy from the book, so in some ways it made sense. But studio heads felt she wouldn't be able to carry the role, and ultimately it went to Judy Garland. And that seems like the logical choice. Yes? Well, the film was originally under the direction of Richard Thorpe, who set the stage for a very different version of Oz than the one we got. A version of Oz that almost catered to the costumed melodrama that the film industry had just started to move away from in this post-silent film world. He famously put Judy in a glamorous blonde wig, and by all reports, her initial take on Dorothy was very different. Yeah, in my opinion, the reason Shirley wouldn't have worked for the movie was because she would have played the whole thing very cutesy, very cute. We would have missed out on the depth of everyone's favorite farm girl. But that almost happened anyway with Judy because of the blonde wig and Richard Thorpe. It wasn't until production had to stop because Buddy Epson needed to be recast for medical reasons that the studio took a look at what Thorpe had been shooting. At that point, they'd only been shooting for roughly a week, but after seeing what he did, make it sound so dramatic, but it is. After seeing what he did, they slammed the brakes on him as the director, and they brought in George Cukor, not necessarily to direct the movie completely, but to course correct the movie. And praise be to George Cukor. I'm convinced I'm pronouncing that wrong. Someone will correct me in the comments. Georgie boy, is the one who took off the blonde wig and reminded Judy that Dorothy is just a little girl from Kansas. No matter how talented Judy was, I firmly believe if George had not stepped in with that single piece of advice, the movie would not have worked, because he understood the single most important thing about The Wizard of Oz, which is that it is anchored by the most exceptional, unexceptional character. When the film resumed production, Judy gave the performance of a lifetime, which captured the spirit of Baum's Dorothy in a capacity which would go on to solidify the film as a classic and the character as a classic, and also as a gay icon. Because, in the years following the film's release, the term friend of Dorothy truly started to take off. And even though the origin is unknown, it's widely accepted that that was born out of Judy's performance as Dorothy Gale. Partially for the reasons I've already mentioned about how the story itself has a plethora of queer themes, but also because she has a song about a rainbow, but also because she was played by Judy Garland, someone who connected with the queer community throughout her career by taking on roles that explored themes of acceptance, love, and finding hope in a hopeless world. These are all ideas that resonated profoundly with queer audiences, and she did those roles while pouring out her heart through song. And whether it's in a queer context or not, that is really the heartbeat all Dorothys have in common. Finding the hope. It's actually the driving force behind another major Oz adaptation, the 1975 Broadway musical, The Wiz. I think The Wiz is a shining example of what makes The Wizard of Oz so timeless, because without changing a single story beat, the same ideas of home and belonging took on a brand new meaning when they were used to explore Black American culture and joy, with Dorothy right at the center of it. Much like Baum's original novel, it emerged during a time of major social reform. Like I said, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published at a time when early suffragettes were fighting for political equality between men and women. And The Wiz premiered in the years immediately following the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and The Wiz had its Broadway premiere in 1975. This meant that the actors, the artists, and audience members of the original production of The Wiz were all people who would have grown up in the Jim Crow era, where segregation was legal and normalized. And suddenly, these audiences were seeing the quintessential American story told with African American voices. And consider that in The Wiz on stage, Dorothy is a little girl, much like in Baum's book, aged somewhere between 12 to 15, which means that she would have been from the first generation to grow up in a post-civil rights movement America, which just feels so on brand for Dorothy, because she was a beacon of hope for the future. A Black girl standing front and center, headlining a new interpretation of the most quintessential American story, and not just in the spotlight, but in the spotlight in a narrative of self-discovery, love, and community. These types of stories had almost always been told by white characters for white audiences. Of course, Dorothy and The Wiz underwent some major changes when the musical was adapted for the big screen, because on stage, the role was originated by Stephanie Mills. She was only 17 during the Detroit tryout, and she made her Broadway debut with the production a year later. But when the film came around, a series of crazy, not so random happenstances led to the role going to Diana Ross, superstar Diana Ross. I have actually already done an entire video about Stephanie Mills and Diana Ross in regard to Dorothy, so I invite you to go give that a watch if you're interested in that history. But the short version of the story is that Diana Ross wanted to play Dorothy in the movie, and she was at a point in her career where basically she could just make that happen. And she made it happen. The only thing is that Stephanie Mills was still a teenager when the film was in production, and Diana Ross was in her early 30s. And if you actually look at the comments on my Stephanie Mills / Diana Ross video, a lot of them say variations of the same thing to varying levels of politeness. Dorothy is supposed to be a little girl, and Diana was too old. And on the one hand, in theory, yes, that holds true for Dorothy as she appeared on stage in The Wiz. But the character was reworked for the film to be an adult. And it's honestly the reason that I love the Wiz movie so much, because it really leans into Dorothy's journey of self-discovery from an adult's perspective. In the film, Dorothy is a kindergarten teacher living with her aunt and uncle in Harlem, and she is a very withdrawn, solitary person. And we're even told that she has never been south of 125th Street in her life. And I think that's a brilliant change, because throwing her into Oz takes her out of her comfort zone in a way that just hits differently from when Dorothy is a child. Make Dorothy an adult with social anxiety, and suddenly all these elements of chosen family and gaining companions takes on a brand new meaning that I think is beautifully summarized in the final scene when she meets the wizard, Richard Pryor, a character who is almost a mirror to her. Someone who has spent his life hiding the way that Dorothy wanted to before she ended up being thrown into Oz. And when he asks Dorothy for help, she says my favorite line in the entire film. They've had what they've been searching for in them all along. I don't know what's in you, but I do know one thing. You'll never find it in the safety of this room. I tried that all my life. It doesn't work. There's a whole world out there, and you have to begin by letting people see who you really are. And then she sings the signature song from The Wiz, Home. And I want to take this moment to talk about how The Wiz is a pitch perfect companion piece to MGM's Wizard of Oz, because both adaptations give Dorothy a song that bookends her journey beautifully. In Somewhere Over the Rainbow, we get optimism through song, the ultimate wish to be somewhere better than where we are. That's the start of her journey. In Home, we get an end of journey reflection on what that place actually is. A place where there's love overflowing. I'm not going to sing it for you. And somewhere in between these two songs and in between these two Dorothys, I think it's really clear that the message, there's no place like home, isn't about a specific place. It's about finding your place, about finding your people, your family. And while this is typically interpreted as a message of hope, when we moved into the latter half of the 20th century, this idea of finding home was turned onto its head when we entered a revisionist Oz era with Disney's cult classic Return to Oz. Walt Disney, the man and the studio, have a long history with trying to get an Oz project off the ground. And for a long time, they held the rights to all of L. Frank Baum's Oz books except the first one. And then when we hit the 1980s, they were in this weird position where those books were about to go into the public domain. So them having the rights wouldn't mean much in a couple years. And they also couldn't touch the original story because MGM still had a stronghold on that. So what did they do? They crafted a film based on books 2 and 3. The Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz, and gave us Return to Oz. And what a wild movie it is. It's a sequel to a film that basically doesn't exist. It was kind of marketed as a follow-up to MGM's Oz, but instead of bright colors and whimsy and hope, we got Dorothy being used as a guinea pig for experimental shock therapy. And among the many, many differences between this film and past Oz adaptations, Return to Oz gave us an accurately aged Dorothy in Fairuza Balk, who was only 9 years old when she shot the movie. And oddly enough, the movie with the youngest Dorothy is the most messed up out of all the Oz movies. It's the most profoundly disturbing. And I don't just mean because of stuff like this, or these. I have said it on this channel before. What makes Return to Oz so sad and so scary is that it's ultimately a coming-of-age story where the main character realizes that their home is not their safe space. The film is very much like Act 2 of Into the Woods. It's diving into what happens after the seemingly happy ending. Yes, Dorothy made her way home after her adventure in Oz, but upon being reunited with Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, they signed her up for experimental shock therapy to help her get rid of all those bad dreams, aka the Oz stories and the experiences that brought her a lot of joy. Her experiences in Oz aren't seen as magical, they are seen as problems that need to be eliminated. So Dorothy goes from a place of found family and acceptance to a place of judgment. And her second adventure in Oz is ultimately a confirmation that even though her house may be in Kansas, her home is in Oz. And in some ways, this actually is book accurate to L. Frank Baum's Oz series, because Dorothy in those books ultimately does decide that she's happier in Oz than she is in Kansas. But Return to Oz really puts that decision in a dark, realistic context. And I will always bring it back to the final scene of the film, when Ozma appears in the mirror and Dorothy has the opportunity to prove to Auntie Em that Oz is real, but she does not take it. She chooses to let Oz remain her personal secret, because the big lesson she learned on this adventure was that the adults and the family in her life could not be trusted. In a lot of ways, Return to Oz was so far ahead of its time, because it was really the first reimagining we got of Oz. And I do think it ushered in that new era, that revisionist era, where creators and audiences had mostly all grown up with Oz woven into the fabric of pop culture. We all had fond memories of just how optimistic and euphoric the original story was. And for those of us who grew up with the MGM film, it became a narrative largely associated with childhood. But as we became older, it became a narrative that could be revisited and questioned. And that put Dorothy in a very interesting place as sort of a blank canvas for storytellers. Because no matter how you spin it, Dorothy's time in Oz represents a series of life-changing experiences. And it begs the question, where does someone go from there? Return to Oz gave us one answer, and more recent adaptations have also explored Dorothy's life post-Oz, with just 2 examples being her brief yet memorable portrayal in Once Upon a Time and her portrayal in Danielle Paige's young adult series, Dorothy Must Die. I'm going to admit, I have not read Dorothy Must Die, but the wiki page filled me in. And my understanding is that the series is built on this idea that once Dorothy got to go home to Kansas, she decided she wanted to go back to Oz. And once she gets there, she takes control of all the magic and becomes a power-hungry dictator who must be stopped, or as the title would suggest, must die. In Once Upon a Time, we actually see two versions of Dorothy. One when she's a child, and then again when she returns as an adult. As a child, she's essentially the classic image of Dorothy, but when she's reintroduced as an adult, she has fully come into herself as an established witch hunter, and she is also canonically queer as she begins a relationship with Little Red Riding Hood. I personally prefer her depiction in Once Upon a Time because to me it feels more aligned to Baum canon for the type of person I believe Dorothy would grow up to be, someone fighting for human rights. But Danielle Paige's interpretation is just as interesting because her Dorothy has the same starting point, but she handles her childhood trauma differently, leading her down a darker road, almost as a cautionary tale. I think. Again, I don't know. I didn't read the book. I only have so many hours in any given day. But to bring it back to Wicked, every time Dorothy has been revisited or reinvented, it's been within a capacity where she was the main character who could be properly explored, either by building on the Dorothy that you already know or by subverting expectations. And at this point in time, The Wizard of Oz is so firmly established in our minds that you cannot revisit a character like Dorothy without care and consideration for the 125 years worth of history that follows that character. It isn't just that people would compare a new Dorothy to Judy Garland. It's that Dorothy represents so many different things to so many different people that she either needs to be the main attraction or nothing at all. So if we, in fact, do not see Dorothy's face or hear a single spoken line from her in Wicked for Good, I'm convinced that will be the strongest choice because we know who she is. She's Dorothy. She's all of us. She's gloriously nostalgic while always being ahead of her time. And there will undoubtedly be more adaptations that continue to reinvent and revisit her. And Wicked is just not that story. But I, for one, cannot wait to see what Dorothy does next. And with that, friends, this concludes yet another episode of Teacup for One. Now, let me know in the comment section down below, aside from Judy Garland, who is your favorite Dorothy, and or which film, young adult novel, Broadway musical, video game, piece of media, whatever, like what version of Wizard of Oz has your favorite Dorothy? Let me know. And if you want to be the first to know when I release more videos talking about Oz, Wicked, Disney, Shakespeare, Cats, Funko Pops, apparently they might be going out this now. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. And if you haven't subscribed already, it is super easy. All you have to do is click on my face. Thanks for joining me today, everyone. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the T for one. Go away.